In the cozy Millstone Cafe, tension crackles when Marjorie Leighton publicly shames Calvin Ror, a quiet man in a worn military jacket, dismissing him as unworthy of the diner's charm. Unbeknownst to her, Calvin is the cafe's owner and a Vietnam War hero who saved lives at great personal cost. As whispers of his past ripple through the stunned diners, a mysterious figure, Colonel David Klene, arrives, poised to reveal Calvin's hidden legacy. Will this revelation shift hearts and restore respect? Or will old judgments linger? The truth hangs in the air, waiting to unfold. Have you met a quiet hero like Calvin? Share your story below. If this tale of hidden honor moved you, like, subscribe, and share it with someone who values respect. Join us to celebrate unsung heroes. Your support keeps these stories alive. Thank you, and we'll see you next time. The Millstone Cafe in Brookfield, Missouri, hummed with the comforting chaos of a Saturday morning. The air was thick with the aroma of sizzling bacon, freshly baked biscuits, and the faint tang of coffee brewed strong enough to wake the sleepiest trucker. Wood-paneled walls soaked up the chatter of locals catching up before church or winding down from the farmer's market. Worn leather booths creaked under the weight of familiar faces, and the clatter of forks against plates created a rhythm as steady as the town itself. For most, it was a haven of routine, a place where time seemed to pause, wrapping everyone in a warm, predictable embrace. But beneath the surface, an undercurrent of tension simmered, like the faint crackle of static before a summer storm. Grace, a 17-year-old waitress with dreams bigger than Brookfield, darted through the diner with 3 steaming mugs balanced in one hand. Her ponytail swayed as she sidestepped a toddler giggling near the jukebox, her sneakers squeaking faintly on the checkered tile floor. She was saving every tip for college, each crumpled dollar a step toward a future beyond the diner's walls. She knew the regulars by name, their quirks, their orders. Mr. Thompson liked his eggs sunny side up. Mrs. Carter always asked for extra cream. But today, something felt off. The air carried a weight she couldn't name, and her usual smile faltered as she sensed eyes lingering too long, voices dropping too low. In the corner booth where the morning light spilled through the window in soft golden waves, sat Calvin Ror, his olive-drab military jacket, faded and frayed at the cuffs, hung loosely on his frame. His hands, weathered and calloused, cradled a mug of coffee that had long since stopped steaming. He stared out the window, his gray eyes tracing the quiet street beyond, as if the world inside the diner didn't exist. To most, he was just a quiet old man, a fixture as unremarkable as the jukebox or the chipped sugar bowls. But to Calvin, that booth was more than a seat. It was a sanctuary, a place where memories of better days lingered, heavy as the mug he gripped. He didn't sip the coffee. He held it, as if the warmth could anchor him against the weight of a past he carried alone. The glass door swung open with a jangle, and Marjorie Leighton strode in, her presence slicing through the diner's warmth like a cold wind. In her early 70s, Marjorie carried herself with the unshakable confidence of someone who believed the world owed her deference. Her navy blazer was crisp, her pearl earrings gleamed, and her heels clicked sharply against the tile, each step a declaration of her importance. She clutched her designer purse tightly, as if the diner's modest charm might taint it. Her sharp blue eyes scanned the room, taking in every detail with the precision of a hawk. To her, the Millstone wasn't a haven. It was a stage, and she was the star, entitled to rewrite the scene as she saw fit. Her gaze landed on Calvin, and her lips curled into a sneer. The sight of him, his worn jacket, his stillness, his very existence, ignited something in her. Disgust, perhaps, or a need to assert her place above someone she deemed lesser. She didn't know him, didn't care to. All she saw was a man who didn't belong in her vision of the Millstone's charm. "Excuse me," she snapped, her voice cutting through the diner like a whip. The chime above the door seemed to echo her words, and every head turned. Grace froze mid-step, the mugs in her hand trembling as coffee sloshed dangerously close to the rims. Her heart thudded, a mix of embarrassment and dread. She didn't know what was coming, but she felt it. The kind of moment that could unravel the fragile peace of a small-town morning. Marjorie's perfectly manicured finger pointed across the diner, straight at Calvin. "This place is for decent folks, not people like that." Her words landed like a slap, sharp and deliberate. The clatter of forks stilled. A mother at a nearby table hushed her child, who had been giggling moments before. A man in overalls paused, his fork hovering over a stack of pancakes, his brow furrowing as he glanced toward the corner booth. Grace swallowed hard, her throat tight. She wanted to disappear, to melt into the floor, but her feet stayed rooted. She looked at Calvin, expecting some reaction. Anger, shame, anything. But he didn't move. Not a flinch, not a blink. His hands stayed wrapped around the mug, his knuckles pale as if he were holding on to something far heavier than coffee, a lifetime of battles, losses, and unspoken sacrifices. Marjorie wasn't done. Her voice rose, shrill with contempt. That filthy jacket, he looks like he hasn't bathed in a week. And you let him sit by the window? It's disgusting. Her words dripped with venom, each one a calculated jab meant to wound. She didn't know Calvin, didn't know that the jacket he wore was a relic of a war he'd survived, a war that still haunted his dreams. She didn't know that the diner she stood in, with its warm wood walls and creaky booths, had been built by his hands decades ago, back when Brookfield was just a speck of hope in his heart. To her, he was nothing but a blemish on her perfect morning. Grace's eyes darted toward the kitchen, praying for the manager to appear and diffuse the situation. But the swinging doors stayed still, and she was alone in the spotlight. Her voice, when it came, was soft, almost a whisper. Ma'am, he's a regular here. The words felt inadequate, a flimsy shield against Marjorie's wrath. She wanted to say more, to defend Calvin, but the weight of every eye in the diner pressed against her, stealing her courage. Marjorie's gaze snapped to her, sharp and unforgiving. I don't care if he built this place with his bare hands, she spat. It's upsetting. It ruins the whole atmosphere. Her words hung in the air, heavy and final, daring anyone to challenge her. Behind Grace, the diner was silent. No one spoke. No one moved. The mother clutched her child closer, the man in overalls stared at his plate, and the truckers at the counter sipped their coffee in slow, deliberate silence. Grace's heart pounded, her mind racing. She wanted to scream that Marjorie was wrong, that Calvin was more than his worn jacket, more than the quiet man in the corner. But her lips stayed sealed, her fear louder than her conviction. Calvin stirred, just enough to break the spell. His movements were slow, deliberate, as if each one cost him something. He reached into his pocket, his fingers trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of dignity he refused to let Marjorie strip away. He placed a $5 bill on the table beside his untouched coffee, the gesture quiet but resolute. No protest, no defense, no glare to match Marjorie's venom. He stood, favoring one leg, his limp more pronounced now, a silent testament to wounds that ran deeper than anyone in the diner could see. His back was straight, his gaze fixed forward, as if the weight of Marjorie's words couldn't touch him. He walked toward the door, each step measured, each one a refusal to bow. Grace stepped aside instinctively, her heart a tangle of guilt and admiration. She wanted to call out to him, to apologize, to beg him to stay, but her voice caught in her throat, and all she could do was watch as Calvin moved toward the door, his silhouette framed by the morning light. The diner held its breath, forks poised midair, hearts stirring with something unspoken. In that moment, no one knew that the man they'd let Marjorie shame was the very soul who'd given them this place, a man whose hands had built the walls that sheltered them, whose heart still carried the weight of a town that had forgotten him. The bell above the diner's door chimed softly as he stepped out into the cold morning air, leaving a heavy stillness in his wake. Marjorie let out a sharp breath, her shoulders stiffening as she turned back to the counter, her hands busying themselves with wiping down an already spotless surface. To anyone watching, it might have seemed like just another moment in the daily rhythm of the diner, plates clinking, coffee brewing, the low hum of conversation. But the air felt different now, charged with something unspoken. Shame lingered like a bitter aftertaste, mingling with confusion and a deeper, unnamed feeling that seemed to settle into the bones of everyone in the room. No one could have guessed that the man who'd just been dismissed with a sneer, or the man they'd all watched walk away, was the very soul who kept this place alive. In a matter of moments, that truth would unravel, and it would shake them all to their core. Calvin Ror carried his past like a weight he'd learned to balance, never letting it tip into view. He didn't speak of the war, not out of emptiness, but because the truths that mattered most were the hardest to give voice to. At 19, he'd been thrust into the chaos of Da Nang, Vietnam, barely old enough to cast a vote, but already burdened with the lives of others. As a Marine recon scout, he was trained to move like a shadow, to survive in places where danger was as constant as the air he breathed. His days were spent deep in the jungle, where the world was a tangle of green and menace. He gathered intelligence, etched paths through unforgiving terrain, and learned to trust his instincts when even the trees seemed to conspire against him. Every step was a gamble, every sound a potential threat. Yet Calvin carried on, driven by a quiet resolve that had been forged long before he ever set foot in that war. His final mission haunted him still, a memory etched in the ache of his bones. It was monsoon season when the rain fell in sheets so thick it seemed to drown the world. His unit had been tasked with rescuing 2 Navy medics trapped after their chopper crashed near the Laotian border. The intel was shaky, radio contact long gone, but orders were orders, and Calvin had never been one to falter. Under a sky black as pitch, he led his men through the deluge, the rain so relentless it muffled the squelch of their boots in the mud. He moved on instinct, his senses sharpened by months in the wild, until he found the clearing, a miracle in itself. The medics were there, huddled beneath the twisted wreckage of the chopper, alive but barely, with enemy forces closing in like wolves. There were 7 of them in that moment. Only 6 would walk away. Calvin was the last to retreat, ensuring every man was ahead of him when the mortar struck. The sound came first, a deep, bone-rattling crack that split the night. Then came the heat, a searing wave that stole his breath. Then nothing. He woke a week later in a military hospital in Japan, his body a map of pain. Shrapnel had lodged in his spine, his hearing was gone in one ear, and his leg was a ruin that would never heal right. The doctor called him lucky. Calvin didn't feel dead. He felt like a man left half-finished, a mission abandoned mid-step. Coming home was no hero's welcome. There were no parades, no banners waving in the breeze. Instead, there was silence, a cold, creeping kind that followed him everywhere. People crossed the street to avoid the man with the limp, their eyes sliding away as if his presence was a reminder of something they'd rather forget. Job applications vanished into bureaucratic voids, and whispers trailed him in grocery stores, murmurs about those guys from over there. But Vietnam veterans weren't greeted as heroes. They were treated like ghosts, relics of a war no one wanted to remember. So Calvin did what ghosts do. He disappeared. He drifted west to Missouri, a place where his name meant nothing, and bought a crumbling diner with the scraps of his VA compensation and a loan that felt like a lifeline. He didn't tell anyone about his past. No medals adorned the walls, no stories of valor spilled from his lips. Instead, he poured himself into the diner, working 16-hour days with a quiet ferocity. He flipped eggs at dawn, mopped floors at midnight, and patched leaks with duct tape and sheer will. There were no complaints, no fanfare, just a man doing what needed to be done. But beneath his silence, Calvin never stopped serving. When a man stumbled in from the cold, with empty pockets, Calvin made sure a plate of eggs and toast found its way to his booth, no questions asked. When a mother stretched one meal to feed her 3 kids, Calvin doubled the portion and brushed it off with a warm smile. When a young veteran sat at the counter, his hands trembling and his eyes distant, Calvin poured the coffee, extra hot, and let the silence be a kind of comfort. Beyond the diner's walls, his kindness rippled outward. He paid neighbors' heating bills through a local charity, always anonymously. He donated to the VFW chapter, but never set foot in their meetings. After storms tore through town, he helped patch roofs, and he left groceries on porches without so much as a knock. The diner thrived not because the food was exceptional, though it was good, but because Calvin fed more than hunger. He fed dignity, hope, a sense of being seen. Yet no one knew the depth of it. There were no plaques on the walls, no articles in the local paper, no stories traded over coffee. Just a man in a faded military jacket, limping slightly, serving pancakes with a focus that suggested his life depended on it. Until that morning when a pointed finger and a cruel word tried to erase him, something in the town began to shift, a truth ready to break free and change everything. The Millstone Cafe stood quiet under the weight of a morning that felt heavier than most. When the front door groaned open, it did so without the usual chime of its bell, as if the air itself had thickened with anticipation. A tall man crossed the threshold, his civilian attire, a neatly pressed coat and slacks, doing little to mask the decades of military discipline etched into his posture. His shoulders were squared, his chin lifted, and his eyes moved across the room with the precision of a hawk circling its prey. Colonel David Klene, though retired, carried an aura that demanded attention, even if he didn't intend it. To the untrained eye, he might have been just another aging man with salt and pepper hair. But the way he stood, feet slightly apart, hands clasped behind his back, spoke of a life shaped by command. The hum of the diner faltered. Forks paused midair, coffee cups lingered untouched, and conversations dissolved into a hush. Grace, stationed behind the soda fountain, felt her breath snag in her chest, an instinctive reaction to the shift in the room's atmosphere. She couldn't place why her heart quickened, but her eyes followed Klene as he scanned the cafe, his gaze settling on an empty booth in the corner. The seat Calvin had occupied only moments ago still held his half-full mug, steam curling faintly from the untouched coffee. Klene's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes, a flicker of recognition, betrayed his purpose. "Excuse me," he said, approaching the counter. His voice was steady, authoritative without being loud, the kind that carried weight without effort. "I'm looking for a man named Calvin Ror. I saw him step out just now." Marjorie, perched on a stool nearby, glanced up from her plate with a faint scowl. Her lips pursed, and she let out a small, dismissive sniff. "If you're talking about that homeless man who was sitting over there earlier, he's gone. Good riddance, if you ask me." Her words dripped with disdain, and she turned back to her food, oblivious to the tension they stirred. Grace's mouth parted as if to protest, but no words came. She glanced at Klene, whose jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Without another word, he turned and strode toward the door, his steps brisk and purposeful. Outside, the morning light cast long shadows across the parking lot, where Calvin stood beside his battered Chevy pickup. His hands fumbled with his keys, his limp more pronounced in the unforgiving daylight. He hadn't noticed the sleek SUV parked a few spaces away, nor the man approaching with long, determined strides. But the rhythm of those footsteps, crisp, deliberate, struck a chord deep in his memory. Calvin turned slowly, his weathered face tightening as his eyes met Klene's. Recognition hit him like a wave, and for a moment he seemed to shrink under its weight. "Colonel, just David now," Klene said, extending a hand. His tone was warm but firm, carrying a quiet insistence that this was no chance encounter. Calvin hesitated, his calloused hand hovering before finally grasping Klene's. His grip was strong, but his eyes darted nervously toward the diner's windows, where he could feel the weight of curious stares pressing against the glass. "Sir, if this is about some ceremony or press nonsense," Calvin's voice was low, almost pleading, as if he could will this moment away. Klene shook his head, cutting him off gently. "This isn't about that, Calvin. This is personal." His voice softened, but there was a steel beneath it, a resolve that made Calvin's shoulders slump. "I've been looking for you. I needed to thank you properly." Calvin shifted, his boots scuffing the gravel. The gratitude in Klene's words felt like a spotlight he didn't want. "Sir, you don't owe me anything," he muttered, his gaze dropping to the ground. "I do," Klene countered, his tone unyielding. "You saved my life, Calvin. You saved my men. Because of you, I walked my daughter down the aisle. I watched my grandson throw his first pitch. None of that happens if you hadn't seen what the rest of us missed that night in Cambodia." His voice cracked slightly, betraying the depth of his gratitude. He paused, letting the words settle, then glanced back at the diner. "You trying to disappear?" he asked, his tone softer now, almost fatherly. Calvin's lips twitched, not quite a smile. "Trying not to cause ripples," he said quietly, his eyes flickering toward the highway. Freedom was out there, just a drive away, beckoning with its promise of anonymity. Klene's mouth curved into a half-smile. "Well, I think a ripple's already been made." With that, he turned and headed back toward the diner, his stride as purposeful as before. Calvin stood rooted for a moment, his keys still clutched in his hand. The open road called, but something heavier, something he couldn't name, pulled him back. He followed Klene, his limp slowing his steps but not his resolve. When the door creaked and opened again, the diner fell silent. The clink of silverware vanished, and even the fry cook paused, his spatula hovering over the griddle. Marjorie's head snapped up, her brow furrowing. "What's he doing back here?" she muttered, her voice sharp with irritation. Klene raised a hand, a subtle gesture that commanded the room's attention. "I'd like to say something," he announced, his voice clear and steady. He placed a hand on Calvin's shoulder, a gesture both grounding and protective. "This man," he said, pausing to let every eye in the room settle on Calvin, "is Calvin Ror. He's the owner of this cafe, and he's one of the finest Marines I ever had the privilege of serving with." The room seemed to hold its breath. Klene's words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. "He didn't ask me to come here. He didn't even want me to. But I came anyway, because people should know who he is, because they should know what he's done." His gaze swept the diner, lingering on Marjorie's stunned expression, on Grace's wide eyes, on the faces of strangers who suddenly felt like witnesses to something sacred. Calvin stood stiffly, his hands clasped in front of him, his eyes fixed on the floor. The weight of Klene's words pressed against him, stirring memories he'd spent years burying. He felt exposed, raw, but beneath it all, a flicker of pride stirred, something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time. In the quiet hum of the diner, where the clink of coffee cups and the soft murmur of conversation usually reigned, a heavy silence fell. It wasn't the kind of silence that felt empty. It was thick, charged with the weight of revelation. Eyes darted across the room, settling on Calvin Ror, a man who had spent years blending into the background, pouring coffee, wiping counters, and keeping the diner's heart beating. He wasn't just the man behind the counter, he was the soul of this place, a quiet hero who had saved lives, built this haven, and asked for nothing in return. Now, for the first time in years, people saw him, really saw him, and the weight of that gaze stirred something deep within him. Grace, the waitress who had worked alongside Calvin for years, felt her throat tighten as tears brimmed in her eyes. She gripped the coffee pot in her hands, its warmth grounding her as her heart raced with a mix of pride and sorrow. She had always known that Calvin was more than he let on, but hearing his story laid bare like this, it was as if the veil had been lifted. She thought of all the mornings they'd shared, the way he'd hum softly while scrubbing the grill, never once hinting at the burdens he carried. Her chest ached with admiration, but also with guilt for not asking sooner, for not seeing the depth of the man she called a friend. At the back table, a young man in a worn jacket sat hunched, his head bowed as if the weight of Calvin's story pressed directly on his shoulders. He was irregular, always quiet, always scribbling in a notebook between sips of coffee. Now his pencil lay still, forgotten, as he wrestled with his own thoughts. He'd come to the diner to escape the chaos of his life, to find a moment of peace in the rhythm of clinking dishes and Calvin's steady presence. But now, knowing who Calvin was, a Marine, a survivor, a man who had faced horrors and still chose kindness, made him feel small. Not in a bad way, but in the way that makes you want to be better, to live up to the quiet strength of someone who had endured so much and still showed up every day. A trucker at the counter, his calloused hands wrapped around a chipped mug, set his coffee down with deliberate care. His weathered face, usually set in a tired scowl, softened as he stared into the dark liquid. He'd seen men like Calvin before, veterans who carried their scars in silence, who didn't need to shout about their courage because it was woven into their every action. The trucker's mind drifted to his own father, a man who had fought in Korea and come back quieter, harder to reach. He wondered if he'd ever truly seen his father either, or if he'd been too caught up in his own life to notice. Marjorie Leighton sat frozen in her booth, her perfectly manicured hands clasped tightly in her lap. The air around her felt suffocating, as if the silence had wrapped itself around her throat. For decades, she had crafted an impeccable image, pearls gleaming, blazer crisp, every word measured and poised. She had built a fortress of control, a shield against the world's judgment, But now that armor felt flimsy, like tissue paper crumbling under the weight of truth. She had dismissed Calvin as a nobody, a mere fixture in this small-town diner, someone beneath her notice. The sting of her own words echoed in her mind, and the realization that she had insulted a man of such quiet, unshakable strength burned deeper than any public rebuke ever could. Calvin stood by the counter, his broad shoulders still, his gaze fixed on the worn linoleum floor. He wasn't used to being seen, not like this. The eyes of the room felt heavy, not with judgment, but with something else. Respect, gratitude, a quiet awe. He had saved lives in the war, carried the weight of those years in the lines of his face, in the quiet way he moved through the world. Yet now, as the diner's patrons looked at him, he felt a flicker of something unfamiliar. Vulnerability, perhaps, or the strange warmth of being known. Marjorie stood, her heels clicking sharply against the tile as she crossed the room toward him. Each step felt like a journey through a storm of her own making. Her heart pounded, not with the confidence she usually wore like a second skin, but with a raw, unsteady fear. She had spent her life avoiding moments like this, moments where her carefully curated facade might crack. "Mr. Ror," she began, her voice thin and trembling, so unlike the polished tone she was known for. She paused, searching for the right words, but they felt inadequate. "Calvin," he corrected gently, looking up. His eyes were quiet, but carried a weight that seemed to hold entire lifetimes. Years of sacrifice, loss, and resilience. Marjorie felt her breath catch. She had never seen eyes like his, eyes that didn't demand anything but seemed to see straight through her. "I owe you," she said, her voice faltering as she fought to reclaim the dignity she had always clung to. "I owe you a very deep apology." Calvin didn't respond immediately. He stood there, steady as always, letting her words settle into the silence. Marjorie's hands began to shake, a rare betrayal of her composure. "I didn't know who you were," she continued, her voice trembling now. "That doesn't excuse what I said, but it might explain it. You see," she swallowed hard, her throat tight with the weight of her confession. "My husband, Richard, was in the Navy. He served in Vietnam, like you. He came back different. Nightmares haunted him, woke him screaming, drenched in sweat. He couldn't hold a job, couldn't escape the stares of people who saw him as broken." Grace, still standing by the soda fountain, watched with the forgotten coffee pot in her hands. Her heart ached for Marjorie, for the pain in her trembling voice, but also for Calvin, who stood so still, absorbing the weight of her words. Marjorie pressed on, her voice cracking like thin ice. "I spent years trying to make him look normal, polishing his shoes, covering his burns with long sleeves, anything to shield him from judgment. And yet, here I am, doing to you exactly what I hated others doing to him." The diner remained silent, every patron holding their breath, as if the air itself was waiting for what came next. Marjorie's eyes glistened with tears, unashamed now, as she met Calvin's gaze again. "When I saw you this morning, I didn't see you. I saw my own fear, my shame, my weakness. I can't undo what I said, but I can say I'm sorry. Truly." Calvin nodded, a simple, quiet gesture that carried no judgment, only understanding. "We all have bad days," he said, his voice low and gravelly, worn by years' excellency. "I hope tomorrow's better for you." There was no lecture, no list of his deeds, no demand for more. Just a nod, a moment of grace that said more than words ever could. Grace blinked, her chest tight with emotion. She had braced for a confrontation, for some dramatic unraveling. But this quiet exchange, this raw human moment, was something deeper, something stronger. Marjorie stood there staring at Calvin, her polished exterior softened by the weight of her own vulnerability. And Calvin, for the first time in years, felt the warmth of being seen, not as a shadow behind the counter, but as a man whose life had mattered, whose strength had carried him through, and whose presence had quietly changed the room around him. Marjorie stood frozen for a moment, her breath catching as if the air itself held something heavier than usual. Something that demanded pause. Her fingers trembled, not from cold, but from the weight of a realization settling into her bones. She didn't deserve more, not after the careless words she'd let spill, not after the assumptions that had tumbled out unchecked. Her purse felt heavier than it should as she reached inside, her hand brushing past loose change and crumpled receipts to find the crisp $50 bill she'd tucked away for emergencies. This wasn't an emergency, not in the usual sense, but it felt like one, a quiet, aching need to make things right. She walked back to the booth where Calvin had been sitting moments before, his absence now a silent rebuke. The coffee he'd left behind sat untouched, steam curling faintly upward like a ghost of the conversation that never happened. She placed the bill beside the cup, her fingers lingering as if the gesture could undo her words. Then, without a sound, she turned and left, the bell above the diner's door jingling softly behind her. The silence she left wasn't empty. It was alive, charged with something unspoken, yet profound. The clatter of silverware began again, hesitant at first, like a heartbeat finding its rhythm after a shock. Forks tapped against plates. Spoons stirred sugar into coffee, but the sounds were softer, more deliberate, as if the room itself was holding its breath. The air had shifted, not just in the Millstone Cafe, but in the people who filled it. Grace, standing behind the counter, set the coffee pot down with a quiet thud. Her sleeve brushed against her eyes, catching the dampness that wasn't quite tears, but something close. A fullness in her chest she couldn't name. She wasn't one for crying, not in the middle of a shift, but the ache in her heart felt like it might spill over if she let it. She looked at Calvin, his worn jacket hanging loose on his frame, his limp more pronounced today as he moved toward the kitchen. His hands, rough and scarred, had carried burdens most could only imagine. Lives saved, promises kept, and a quiet that spoke louder than words. When his eyes met hers, he offered a nod, the same one he'd given Marjorie. It wasn't gratitude or instruction, it was acknowledgement, raw and unadorned. In that fleeting moment, Grace felt something click into place. Respect, she realized, didn't need to shout. It didn't demand attention or wave banners. Sometimes it just stood there, steady and unyielding, and that was the most powerful thing she'd ever witnessed. The story didn't stay confined to the diner's walls. It started as whispers, soft and tentative, shared over cups of coffee at the counter. A couple of regulars mentioned it to their neighbors, their voices low as if they were sharing a secret too sacred for loud words. By Sunday, someone's niece had posted about it online, her words clumsy but earnest, capturing the moment in a way that spread faster than anyone expected. Grace, still reeling from what she'd seen, pinned a note to her school's community board, her handwriting neat but trembling. She called it The Man in Booth 3, a title that felt too small for what it described but was all she could manage. By Monday morning, the local radio station had picked it up, a DJ's voice crackling through car speakers across Brookfield. By Friday, the county newspaper ran a small feature, the ink smudging slightly on the cheap paper. No one had orchestrated it, no press release or announcement. Calvin Ror hadn't said a word. He simply showed up the next day, as he always did, 20 minutes before the sun rose, his apron tied neatly, his hands steady as he mixed pancake batter and checked the coffee machine. To him, nothing had changed, but the world around him had begun to tilt. The next morning, when Calvin unlocked the diner's door, a man was already waiting. Mike, a veteran in a wheelchair, his face weathered but his eyes sharp, nodded as Calvin held the door open. The day after that, two older men in Vietnam vet hats took their places near the window, their coffee orders simple, their presence quiet but deliberate. They didn't speak much, just nodded when Calvin limped past, their eyes carrying a shared understanding that needed no words. Then came the Thursdays. Without planning, without flyers or fanfare, more veterans began to arrive early in the morning before the breakfast rush filled the diner with noise. They ordered black coffee and eggs, their voices low, their medals left at home. They claimed the back corner near the restrooms, a space that had once been forgotten but now felt like hallowed ground. They called it Ty's Corner, a name that carried the weight of a man who'd saved lives and then slipped into the quiet rhythm of service. Calvin never joined them at the tables. "It's their space," he'd say, his voice gruff but kind, as he refilled their cups, the coffee somehow never cooling. Grace watched from behind the counter, her heart swelling with something she could only describe as sacred. She began bringing a notebook to work, its pages blank at first but soon filled with names, branches of service, years and places, fragments of lives that had seen too much. Some veterans hesitated when she asked, their eyes distant, but Calvin's nod was enough to loosen their tongues. What started as a private list grew into something more. With her history teacher's help, Grace launched Voices of Service, a project that gave shape to the stories she collected. She sat with veterans from Brookfield and nearby towns, her pen moving quickly as they spoke. Some stories were brief, a single paragraph capturing a moment of courage or loss. Others stretched across hours, filling the air with memories that brought tears or laughter, sometimes both. Each one carried the same quiet strength, sacrifice, dignity, and a silence that spoke louder than any speech. The back corner of the diner transformed. What had been a neglected space became a tribute wall, adorned with photos Grace carefully curated. Some were donated by the veterans themselves, others copied from albums thick with dust. A few even pulled from Calvin's own collection, though he'd sworn he had no such thing. Above it all, Grace's father carved a simple wooden sign, the letters steady and true. Respect is served here. Customers began to add their own pieces to the wall. A woman brought a faded photo of her grandfather in his World War II uniform, his smile frozen in time. A boy in a Cub Scout shirt shyly asked if his great-uncle's dog tags could be displayed, his small hands trembling as he handed them over. The wall grew, not with fanfare but with quiet offerings, each one a thread in a tapestry of memory and honor. Calvin's eyes shimmered with a quiet mist as he stood before the wall, a simple stretch of wood and memory that held more weight than the diner's busiest mornings. He didn't speak, just nodded, his gaze tracing the names etched there, each one a story, a sacrifice, a life that had shaped his own. The air around him felt heavier, not with sorrow, but with a profound respect that seemed to anchor him to the earth. He carried the wall's meaning in his chest, a silent vow to honor those who no longer sat at his tables, whose laughter no longer filled the booths. One unassuming afternoon, Marjorie returned to the Millstone Cafe, stepping through the door as if she'd never left. There was no grand announcement, no flourish to mark her arrival, just the soft jingle of the bell above the entrance and the steady shuffle of her shoes on the linoleum. Beside her stood a lanky teenager, her grandson Eli, draped in a blue hoodie that seemed to swallow his frame. His eyes darted around the diner, cautious but curious, as if he wasn't sure what to make of this place or its people. Marjorie's voice was soft but steady as she introduced him to Calvin. "This is Eli," she said, her words trailing off as she glanced at the boy. "His dad's serving overseas. Marines." The unfinished sentence hung in the air, heavy with unspoken pride and worry, a mother's heart stretched across oceans. Calvin didn't press for details. Instead, he gestured to a booth, his movements deliberate, as if each step was an invitation to belong. For 20 minutes, he sat with Eli, his voice low and warm, weaving a conversation about duty, service, and the ache of coming home. He didn't dwell on the chaos of war, the gunfire, the screams, the nights that never let you sleep. Those memories stayed locked in his own heart, guarded like fragile relics. Instead, he spoke of community, of the honor in showing up for others, of the quiet strength it took to rebuild a life after the world had tried to break you. Eli listened, his hands fidgeting with the edge of his hoodie, but his eyes locked on Calvin's, drinking in every word. When they rose to leave, Eli extended both hands to shake Calvin's, his grip firm, his expression a mix of gratitude and resolve. It was a small moment, but it lingered in the air like the scent of fresh coffee, warm and grounding. A week later, the diner began offering free meals to veterans every Thursday. No signs were posted, no speeches made. The register simply stopped ringing up their tabs, as if the act was as natural as pouring a refill. Grace, the diner's heartbeat, handled it with her usual quiet efficiency, her hands moving swiftly over the counter, her lips pressed into a knowing smile. Calvin covered the cost himself, dipping into his own pocket without a word, as if it were his duty to carry the weight. But the town noticed. Patrons began leaving extra bills tucked under their plates, folded carefully like secrets. Their generosity a silent pact to keep the tradition alive. The diner's spirit shifted, not in its weathered tables or faded menus, but in the way people moved through it. Farmers still grumbled over their big tie breakfast, truckers still demanded extra bacon, and kids still squabbled over jelly packets, their sticky fingers leaving smudges on the table. But there was a new reverence woven into the everyday, a quiet acknowledgement of something sacred. It showed in the way chairs were pulled out for strangers, in the way conversations hushed when someone lingered at the wall, their fingers brushing the names as if they could feel the pulse of those lost. Calvin hated the word hero. It made him wince, his shoulders tensing as if the label were a weight he couldn't bear. To him, heroes were the ones who didn't come back, the ones whose names lived on the wall. But to Grace, and to the countless others who passed through the diner's doors, Calvin was the very definition of the word. He didn't lead with medals or fanfare, but with the steady rhythm of his actions, pouring coffee with care, folding napkins before dawn, limping across the floor to serve people who might never know his story. He showed Grace that true strength wasn't loud or flashy, it was in the quiet choices, the ones no one applauded, that a person could change lives. Calvin had saved men on battlefields, carried their broken bodies through hell, and now he saves souls in a different way, by giving them a place to belong, a cup of coffee to hold, a moment of peace to breathe. Years later, when Grace stood behind a podium at a county event honoring local veterans, her hands trembled as she gripped the edges of the wood. The room was packed, faces turned toward her, expectant. She cleared her throat, her voice steadying as she began. "I didn't learn about war from history books or documentaries," she said, her eyes scanning the crowd, searching for the ghost of those mornings at the diner. "I learned it from a man who woke before the sun, who folded napkins and poured coffee for strangers, who limped across a diner floor with a grace most people never notice. His name was Calvin Ror. He never asked us to remember him, but we do. We always will." The room fell silent, not out of obligation, but out of reverence, the kind that settles deep in your bones. Calvin's legacy wasn't carved in stone or written in textbooks. It lived in the creak of the diner's booths, in the clink of coffee mugs, in the way a small town learned to love a little better because of him. Outside, the sun rose over Brookfield as it always had, painting the two-lane highway in soft gold, brushing the roof of the Millstone Cafe with light as dew clung to its windows. The world beyond the diner rushed forward, cars honking, phones buzzing, lives racing toward the next thing. But inside, time moved differently, slower, with purpose. Calvin's days hadn't changed much. He still arrived before dawn, keys jingling in his hand, his limp steady but never a burden. The routine was his anchor. Unlock the door, flip on the lights, fire up the grill, brew the first pot of coffee, wipe down the corner booth even if it sat empty. But he was no longer unseen. The silence he carried wasn't mistaken for insignificance anymore. It was a presence, a quiet authority that filled the room without demanding attention. People treated him differently now, though he never asked them to. Truckers nodded with a deeper respect, their eyes holding his a moment longer. Veterans offered subtle salutes, a quick 2 fingers to the temple, a gesture just for him. A local pastor began bringing his confirmation class to the diner once a month, their lessons culminating at the wall Grace had built in the back. "Respect is served here," he tells them, his voice firm but warm, "not just in the food, but in the lives of those who serve something greater than themselves." Calvin kept moving, pouring coffee as if it were a sacred act, fixing the world 1 cup at a time. His hands, weathered but steady, carried the weight of a life well lived, a life that had seen the worst of humanity and still chose to serve its best. With hands weathered by time, hands that once hoisted wounded Marines through the dense, unforgiving tangle of jungle underbrush, Calvin Ror now wrestled with the stubborn wobble of a broken table leg in his small diner. The weight of those memories lingered in his calloused palms, each splinter and scrape a silent testament to a life of service that never truly ended. He'd shake his head, a faint smirk tugging at his lips. When the bacon came out too crisp, the edges curling into brittle whispers of what could have been. It wasn't just about the food. It never was. For Calvin, every plate served was an act of care, a quiet vow to keep things right in a world that often felt unsteady. Down the street lived a widow, her mornings softened by the eggs Calvin prepared just the way her late husband once did, each perfectly runny yolk a bridge to a past she clung to. That was Calvin's will. Small gestures, heavy with meaning, offered without fanfare. But something had shifted in him lately. A subtle change that stirred in the quiet moments between the clatter of plates and the hum of conversation. He'd pause at the counter, his gaze drifting to Grace at table 2, her notebook splayed open as she leaned in, listening intently to another veteran's story. Her pen moved with purpose, capturing fragments of lives that might otherwise fade into the noise of the world. Calvin watched her with a mix of pride and melancholy, knowing she was preserving something sacred, something he'd carried in his chest for decades. Then there were the newcomers, strangers who lingered a little longer than expected in front of the tribute wall, a modest collection of faded photos, dog tags, and handwritten names that anchored the diner's heart. Their eyes traced the relics, and Calvin could sense the weight of their unspoken questions, their private reckonings. He didn't need to know their stories to understand their pause. He'd felt that same pull himself years ago in places far from this quiet town. In the back booth, a young soldier on leave sat alone, his fork moving slowly as he ate, his eyes fixed on some distant point only he could see. Calvin noticed him, not with the pity others might offer, but with a quiet recognition. He knew the solitude of a soldier's heart, the way it could feel both heavy and hollow at once. He didn't approach, didn't intrude. Instead, he let the boy eat in peace, knowing that sometimes silence was the greatest respect one could offer. When Calvin caught the young man's eye and offered a small nod, the soldier's faint smile in return carried a depth that words could never touch. To Calvin, that moment was peace, not the kind celebrated with parades or grand speeches, but the kind built in the soft clink of coffee mugs, the shared glances of strangers who found solace in a place that felt like home. This was what he'd fought for, what he'd carried men through fire for, the chance for people to gather, to heal, to remember without being asked to explain. In the quieter moments when the diner slowed and the morning rush gave way to a gentle lull, Calvin would catch his reflection in the front window. The man staring back wore a faded jacket, its threads worn thin from years of use. His hair was thinner now, streaked with silver, and his eyes carried a grayness that spoke of time's relentless march. But behind those eyes burned a quiet fire, a certainty that his life, though not easy, had been honest. He'd lived through war, through loss, through the long ache of coming home to a world that didn't always understand. And yet, here he was, pouring coffee, wiping down counters, offering a smile to anyone who walked through his door. It wasn't glory he sought. It never had been. It was purpose found in the small, unspoken acts that stitched a community together. One morning, as Grace refilled the napkin holder with her usual care, she glanced at Calvin, her eyes catching his in a moment of unguarded warmth. "You ever think about putting those medals out here?" she asked, her voice soft but curious, as if she'd been holding the question for a while. Calvin paused, his hand resting on the register, the hum of the diner fading into the background. He looked at her, then out at the familiar chaos of his little world, the clatter of dishes, the murmur of voices, the sunlight spilling across the worn linoleum floor. "No," he said finally, his voice steady but low, like a river carving its way through stone. "Some men carry their medals on their chests. Others carry them in their silence." The words hung in the air, heavy with truth, and Grace didn't respond. She didn't need to. Her nod was enough, a quiet acknowledgement that she finally saw him, not just the man who served coffee, but the one who carried a lifetime of sacrifice in the lines of his face, in the way he moved through the world with unwavering dignity. To those who knew him, Calvin Ror was more than a diner owner. He was a reminder that strength didn't always roar. It could whisper, steady and unyielding, in the way a man treated a stranger, in the care he took to scrub a countertop until it gleamed, in the forgiveness he offered without being asked, in the memories he honored without needing to speak them aloud. In a world that often rewarded noise, where outrage screamed louder than compassion, Calvin's quiet leadership stood as a beacon. He didn't need a statue or a spotlight. His corner booth, where veterans shared stories over cooling coffee, was his monument. The tribute wall, with its patchwork of names and faces, was his legacy. The town would never forget him, not because he demanded it, but because he earned it, one small, deliberate act at a time. Each morning as he turned the key in the diner's door and watched the first light of day spill across the floor, Calvin felt a quiet certainty settle in his bones. Respect wasn't something you shouted for or claimed with a fist. It was lived, woven into the fabric of everyday choices, the way you listened, the way you served, the way you carried on even when the weight of the past pressed heavy on your shoulders. In a world where headlines chased chaos and silence was mistaken for weakness, Calvin's life was a testament to the power of quiet honor. He didn't need a stage or applause. He lived each day with a dignity that spoke louder than words, serving others even when no one was watching. His story was a call to pause, to look closer, to see the strength in those who spoke softly but gave generously. It was a reminder that respect, true respect, was harder to find in a world quick to judge, quick to shout, quick to dismiss. Calvin's life asked those who knew him to reconsider the strangers they passed, the slow-moving figure in line, the quiet soul who didn't flaunt their worth. Some carried their medals on their chests, polished and proud. Others, like Calvin, carried them in the silence of their hearts, their sacrifices etched in every kind word, every patient gesture. Both deserved honor, not for what they demanded, but for what they gave without asking. And in that small diner where the coffee was always hot and the door always open, Calvin Ror showed the world that the truest heroes didn't wear capes. They wore aprons, carried scars, and poured your morning coffee with a history they never needed to speak aloud.